Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time we're taking a look at a vintage amp that's been generating a lot of buzz, the Proton AA-1150.
Yeah, the A1150, or as it's sometimes called, the Proton D1150.
Okay, so two different
Yeah,
names.
you'll see both floating around.
Got it. So Proton AA-1150, D1150, whatever you want to call it.
Exactly.
Why are we looking at this? Well, from what I understand, this amp is kind of a hidden gem. You know, one of those things that audiophiles in the know are like, oh yeah, that's a great little amp.
Yeah, you mostly find them on the used market these days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you don't see them new anymore, of course,
Yeah.
but it's developed a bit of a cult following, especially among people who like to tinker and find those sort of diamond in the rough components.
Interesting. So we're diving in to see if this amp lives up to the hype. We've got some reviews, some technical tests, all pointing to the AA-1150 being a real giant killer.
A giant killer.
I
Yeah.
like that. You know, something that punches way above its weight class. So what's the story here? What makes this amp so special?
Well, one of the key things that sets it apart is Proton's dynamic power on demand system, or DPD for short.
DPD. Okay, I've seen that mentioned a few times in the material we've got, but what is that exactly? Is that like a marketing gimmick, or is there something really going on there?
No, it's definitely more than just a gimmick. It's a pretty clever engineering solution that allows the amp to deliver these huge bursts of power when it needs to.
So give me the layman's explanation. How does this DPD thing actually work?
Okay, imagine like a regular amplifier has a steady flow of power, like a garden hose, you know?
Okay.
DPD is more like a pressure washer. It can deliver a short burst of intense power for those big dynamic moments in music, those big crescendos or drum hits.
Oh, I see. So it's not about having this massive engine running all the time.
Right.
It's about having that extra oomph, and I really need it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But how does that actually work on a technical level?
So the amp actually has this two-level power supply system, and it uses capacitors to store up a bunch of energy, and then it can release that very quickly when it needs to.
So it's like a reserve tank of power just waiting to be unleashed.
Yeah, exactly. And that's how it's able to hit those really impressive power numbers.
Now, speaking of power numbers, I was looking at some of the tests, and I saw figures like 324 watts into 8 ohms.
Yep.
And even 811 watts into 2 ohms.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, hold on a second. This is supposed to be like a 50-watt amp, right?
Right, that's the continuous rating, but because of the DPD, it can handle these really short bursts of power that go way beyond that.
So these numbers aren't made up. This is actually what this little amp can do.
Oh yeah, the tests are legit. Tony Wood, who is a very well-respected audio engineer, he did some pretty thorough measurements.
Okay, so Tony Wood has given this thing a stamp of approval.
Absolutely. And those power bursts, I mean, they translate into real-world performance. Like if you're listening to a big orchestral piece.
Yeah.
Or, you've got some really demanding speakers.
Right.
This amp can really deliver that impact and dynamics without breaking a sweat.
So it's not just about loudness. It's about being able to handle those peaks cleanly and without distortion.
Yeah, exactly. And that's actually one of the other remarkable things about the AA-1150. It's incredibly clean.
Really?
Yeah, Tony Wood's measurements show really low distortion levels across the board.
Okay, so we're talking like vanishingly small percentages here.
Tiny, tiny percentages.
But for someone who's not an engineer, what does that actually mean for how the music sounds?
Well, basically, it means you're hearing the music as purely as possible without any added noise or coloration from the amplifier itself. It's like looking through a perfectly clean window. You see everything clearly without any distortion.
That's a good analogy. I like that.
Yeah, and it's really noticeable when you listen to the AA-1150. The music just sounds so clear and effortless and detailed.
So the combination of this clean power and the ability to handle those dynamic peaks is what makes the AA-1150 so special.
That's a big part of it, yeah. And
Yeah.
it's something that you don't really find in many other amplifiers, even modern ones.
I'm starting to see why people rave about this thing.
Yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Okay, so we've talked about the DPD system and how that affects the power and the clarity. But what else makes the AA-1150 stand out? I mean, why is it considered better than some modern amps?
Well, there's something about the sound signature that people really love.
Huh?
It's often described as tube-like.
Tube-like.
Yeah.
So we're talking about that warm, rich sound that you usually associate with those old vintage tube amps.
Exactly, and that's kind of unusual for a solid-state amplifier.
Okay, so this is like a solid-state amp that sounds like a tube amp.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes it so unique. It kind of bridges the gap between the two.
This is fascinating. Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. But hold on. If this amp is so incredible, why is it kind of this hidden gem? Why isn't it more well known?
Well, Proton wasn't like a huge brand name. you know? They weren't like a Sony or a Pioneer or something like that. And they didn't make a ton of these AA-1150s.
So it's kind of a limited production run.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so that explains the rarity, but
Yeah.
why do you think it didn't become more popular in the first place?
You know, it's hard to say, really. Maybe it was just marketing, or maybe people just weren't ready for a solid-state amp that sounded this good, but for whatever reason, it kind of flew under the radar.
So it's like a hidden treasure just waiting to be discovered.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
All right, so we've talked about the GPD system, the unique sound, and the rarity factor.
Mm.
But what about the actual design and build quality of this amp?
Oh, it's a beautiful amp.
Really?
Yeah, it's very well built. It's
Right.
got a robust dual mono design, which means each channel has its own separate power supply.
Okay, so they didn't cut any corners in terms of the construction?
Nope, not at all. And then visually, it's got this really classic understated look with these gorgeous analog power meters that glow when you crank up the volume.
Ooh, I love a good analog meter.
Yeah, they're so satisfying to watch.
It's like having a little light show on your audio rack.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got this powerful, well-built, visually appealing amplifier with this unique technology that delivers this remarkable sound. What's the catch?
Well, the catch is finding one in good condition because they are out there on the used market.
Yeah.
But you got to be patient and you got to know what to look for.
And what about price? What are we talking about here?
Well, typically you'll see them go for around $600 to $750.
Really?
Yeah, which is pretty incredible when you consider the performance you're getting.
That's way less than you'd pay for a comparable modern amp.
Oh, absolutely. You could easily spend 2 or 3 times that amount and still not get the same level of sound quality.
Okay, you've convinced me. I'm officially intrigued. Tell me more.
All right, well, let's dive a little deeper into some of the specifics and see how they all come together to create this legendary status that the AA-1150 has.
Do it.
So we were talking about this tube-like sound that people associate with AA-1150, and I'm curious, like, how do you get that from a solid-state amp? Is it something about the way the DPD system works, or is there something else going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because usually when we talk about tube-like, we're talking about those old vacuum tube amplifiers,
Right.
which have a certain warmth and a certain harmonic richness
Mm-hmm.
that you don't typically find in solid-state amps.
Yeah, and it's definitely not just a marketing thing with the AA-1150. I mean, Tony Wood really delves into this in his review.
Yeah.
And he points to a couple things. One is that the DPD system allows the amp to handle those big musical peaks without straining.
Right.
So you get that sort of effortless dynamic sound that you associate with tubes.
Like the amp can breathe.
Yeah.
You know, it's not being choked off.
Yeah, exactly. It's got that headroom to really let the music expand and flow naturally. And then the other thing is that the AA-1150 seems to have this kind of sweetness in the mid-range frequencies, which is where a lot of the vocals and instruments kind of live.
Right, the heart of the music.
Exactly. And that adds to the overall warmth and listenability.
So it's not just about the power. It's about how that power is being used to shape the sound.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the amp has a personality, you know?
Right.
It's not just this sterile blank slate. It's actually adding something to the music.
And I guess that kind of goes against the conventional wisdom about solid-state amps, which is that they're supposed to be very accurate and very clean, but maybe a little bit cold.
Yeah, that's the stereotype, but the AA-1150 kind of breaks that mold, you know?
Interesting. And I think you also mentioned that this amp is relatively simple in terms of its design.
Yeah, it doesn't have a lot of bells and whistles. You
Right.
know, there's no tone controls or fancy processing or anything like that.
So it's kind of a purist approach.
Yeah, exactly. And some people believe that that's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, that all those extra features can sometimes get in the way of the music.
It's like adding more links to the chain, you know? You just want the shortest pass from the source to the speakers.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's got this unique sound signature. It's got this kind of purist design. But how does it actually handle different types of music? Is it only good for certain genres?
That's one of the things that reviewers keep coming back to is just how versatile this amp is.
Really?
Yeah, you can throw anything at it.
Right.
Classical, jazz, rock, electronic music.
Wow.
And it just seems to handle it all beautifully.
So it's not a one-trick pony.
Nope, not at all. It's a real all-rounder.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the sound, but let's talk about the feel of this amplifier. You said it's a beautiful amp. Can you kind of paint us the picture of what it looks like and what the build quality is like?
Yeah, so imagine this really solidly built piece of audio equipment.
Okay.
It's got a clean, minimalist design. It's not flashy or anything,
Right.
but it's just really well put together. And the front panel is dominated by these big, beautiful analog power meters.
Yeah.
And they kind of glow warmly when you crank up the volume.
I can picture it now.
Yeah, they're so
It's
cool.
like having this little window into the amp's soul, you know?
Exactly. And beyond just the aesthetics, it's built like a tank.
Okay.
It's got a heavy-duty metal chassis, high-quality components, and that dual mono construction that we talked about earlier, which really ensures excellent channel separation.
Remind me again what dual mono means.
So it's basically like having two completely independent amplifiers inside.
Oh, wow.
One for the left channel and one for the right channel.
So there's no crosstalk or interference between the channels.
Exactly, and that really helps to keep the sound clear and focused.
Okay, so it's not just about sounding good. It's about feeling good to use.
Yeah.
It's about having that sense of quality and craftsmanship.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that they don't build them like this anymore.
Speaking of, they don't build them like this anymore.
Yeah.
We keep talking about this as a vintage amp, which it is, obviously. But does that mean that it has any quirks or limitations compared to a modern amp?
That's a good question. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that it doesn't have some of the features you might find on a modern amplifier, like digital inputs or a built-in phono stage or anything like that.
Oh, right. So you'd need to use it with a separate preamp or source component.
Yeah, exactly. But for a lot of audiophiles, that's not a deal breaker.
Right.
In fact, some people actually prefer that kind of simplicity.
That was less to go wrong.
Exactly, and it's a purer signal path.
Okay, so it's a trade-off. You might lose some of those modern conveniences, but you gain that vintage sound and that vintage build quality.
Exactly, and for a lot of people, that's a worthwhile trade-off.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. This DPD system, the tube-like sound, the robust build, this kind of vintage appeal. But I still have one big question, like why is this amplifier so highly regarded even compared to other vintage amplifiers from the same era? What sets it apart?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, what makes the AA-1150 stand out even among other vintage amps from that same period?
Well, for one thing, the DPD system is really unique. You just didn't see that in most amplifiers back then. Most amps from that era were still using pretty conventional power supplies.
So the A1150 was kind of ahead of its time in a way.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And it's not just about having more power. It's about having the right kind of power,
Yeah.
That ability to respond to the dynamics in the music without any strain or harshness.
It's like having that extra gear when you need it.
Exactly. And then there's just something special about the overall sound signature of the AA-1150. Like, it's got that warmth and that musicality that so many modern solid-state amps seem to lack.
We keep talking about this warmth and musicality, but what does that actually mean? Like, if someone's never heard this amp before, how would you describe what it sounds like? Well, it's a little bit subjective, of course, but a lot of people describe it as having a smooth, rich, almost liquid kind of sound. It's not harsh or fatiguing to listen to even for long periods. And instruments sound very natural and well-defined, and there's a really nice sense of space and depth to the soundstage.
So it's not just about the technical measurements. It's about how those measurements translate into a listening experience that's actually enjoyable and emotionally engaging.
Exactly. And that's something that I think a lot of audiophiles feel has been lost in the pursuit of more power and more features in modern amps.
It's like sometimes less is more.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes simplicity is the key. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this resurgence of interest in vintage audio equipment. People are rediscovering the sonic qualities and the craftsmanship of those older components.
So the AA-1150 is a reminder that the best things in life aren't always the newest or the flashiest.
Absolutely. And it's a testament to the engineers who designed these classic amps. They really understood that it's not just about pushing the limits of technology. It's about creating something that connects with people on an emotional level.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
So let's say someone is listening to this and thinking, man, I need to find one of these AA-1150s. What advice would you give them? Where should they start looking?
Well, the used market is definitely the place to go. You can find them on online auction sites, audio forums, even local classifieds sometimes. But you got to be patient.
Yeah, these things aren't exactly common.
Nope. And you want to make sure you're getting one in good condition. So do your research and be prepared to wait for the right deal to come along.
And what about price? I know we mentioned they typically go for around $600 to $750, but is there any wiggle room there? Or is that pretty much set in stone?
Well, it can vary a bit depending on the condition and the seller. And, sometimes you can find a better deal if you're patient. But that's a good ballpark figure.
Okay, so be patient. Do your research, and don't be afraid to haggle a little bit.
Exactly. And just remember that with vintage equipment, there's always a chance that it might need some maintenance. So it's a good idea to factor that into the cost.
That's a good point. So always get it checked out by a qualified technician before you really start putting it through its paces.
Exactly.
All right, so to sum it all up, it sounds like the Proton AA-1150 is more than just a vintage amplifier. It's kind of a symbol of a different era of audio engineering, an era where the focus was on sonic purity and musicality rather than just raw power and features.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And it's a reminder that sometimes the real gems are hidden in plain sight, just waiting to be rediscovered.
Well said. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the world of the Proton AA-1150. It's been a real pleasure learning about this amp.
My pleasure. I always love talking about these kind of hidden treasures.
And for our listeners, if you're intrigued by what you've heard today, I encourage you to do some exploring of your own. You never know what sonic wonders you might uncover out there. So until next time, happy listening.